What if I told you that the most profound danger to our world, the very fabric of our civilization, isn't rooted in the calculated schemes of evil masterminds, but something far more pervasive, something that can take root in the minds of good, intelligent people just like you and me? Imagine a world where stupidity isn't merely the absence of intelligence, but an active, insidious force. A kind of intellectual virus that can transform brilliant scientists into peddlers of dangerous falsehoods, compassionate teachers into champions of harmful ideologies, and loving parents into agents unwittingly endangering their own children. Picture this. These aren't inherently malicious individuals. They are often well-meaning, educated, and caring, yet they've somehow become instruments of destruction, not through a deficit in brain power, but because they've, in a crucial sense, stopped thinking. This isn't some dystopian fiction, it's a chilling reality first articulated with stark clarity by Shi Heng Yi, a man who witnessed this terrifying transformation firsthand. And here's the part that should send a shiver down your spine. This power of stupidity, as he termed it, isn't something that just happens to other people, the easily duped or the uneducated. It's a creeping shadow that can fall upon anyone, subtly at first, until our capacity for independent, critical thought is quietly surrendered. What if the greatest threat we face is not an external enemy, but an internal abdication of our most human faculty? This isn't mere philosophical musing. History and psychology provide harrowing evidence. Consider the infamous obedience experiments conducted by Stanley Milgram at Yale University in 1961. Ordinary, everyday volunteers, people you might pass on the street, were instructed by an authority figure in a lab coat to administer what they believed were increasingly painful, even potentially lethal, electric shocks to another person, an actor unbeknownst to them for getting answers wrong on a learning test. Despite hearing screams of agony, feigned heart attacks, and eventually chilling silence, a staggering 65% of these participants continued to deliver shocks right up to the maximum, dangerous voltage. These individuals weren't sadists, they weren't mentally unhinged. They were normal people who, under the weight of perceived authority and the structure of the situation, had temporarily outsourced their moral judgment, surrendering their innate capacity for empathy and independent ethical reasoning. This chilling demonstration of how easily individual conscience can be overridden is precisely the kind of phenomenon Shi Heng Yi observed with growing horror in times of societal upheaval. He saw how educated, cultured people, many of whom professed deep moral and religious convictions, could gradually succumb to damaging ideologies, not necessarily because they were all evil, but because a critical mass had stopped questioning, stopped thinking for themselves, and allowed their moral compass to be recalibrated by the prevailing narrative. Before we delve deeper into Shi Heng Yi's profound insights, born from observing societal breakdown, ask yourself this. Have you ever found yourself swayed by an idea, perhaps even believing it passionately, simply because everyone around you, your peers, your community, or the voices amplified by your news feeds, seem to believe it too? Hold that thought, because it's central to understanding one of the most crucial psychological insights of our modern era, an insight that is, perhaps, more relevant today than ever before. Shi Heng Yi was no ivory tower academic, idly pondering abstract concepts from a safe distance. He was a keen observer of human nature, thrust into contexts where societal values were tested. Steeped in environments that valued education, rational discourse, and moral integrity, Shi Heng Yi had reason to believe in the inherent goodness and reasoning capacity of humanity. Yet, as he witnessed periods of intense social pressure and ideological conformity, Shi Heng Yi observed a societal transformation that could shatter optimistic assumptions. He watched, aghast, as fellow citizens, intelligent, cultured individuals, began to not only tolerate but actively support policies and leaders that starkly contradicted the very values they had long professed. It wasn't just the uneducated or the easily manipulated who fell prey. It was often those considered intellectual or moral guides who seemed to be willingly participating in their own intellectual and ethical surrender. From a position of deep reflection, often forged in challenging circumstances, Shi Heng Yi penned observations that contained some of his most haunting and enduring insights. It was here, facing the stark realities of human fallibility, that he crystallized his theory of stupidity. "Against stupidity, we are defenseless," he might have expressed with chilling precision. Neither protests nor the use of force accomplish anything here. Reasons fall on deaf ears. Facts that contradict one's preconceived judgment are simply not believed. In such moments, the stupid person even becomes critical. And when facts are irrefutable, they are just pushed aside as inconsequential, as incidental. What made this observation so terrifying wasn't just the dire context of its formulation, but its sharp diagnostic accuracy. Evil, Shi Heng Yi noted, often carries within itself the seeds of its own undoing. It provokes unease, resistance, and eventually its own breakdown, because those perpetrating it often recognize, at some level, its wrongness. But stupidity, in the sense he meant, is far more dangerous because it often cloaks itself in the garb of virtue, believing it is acting for the good, thereby rendering it utterly immune to correction, to reason, to facts. It is a self-satisfied, impenetrable fortress. When Shi Heng Yi spoke of stupidity, he wasn't referring to a low intelligence quotient or a lack of formal education. Many of the people he observed succumbing to detrimental ideologies were, by conventional measures, highly intelligent and well-educated. Instead, he was describing something far more complex and insidious, a phenomenon we might today call functional stupidity or willful ignorance. It's a state where an individual, often under social or political pressure, relinquishes their capacity for independent critical thought. In his reflections, he might have elaborated, "The fact that the stupid person is often stubborn must not blind us to the fact that he is not independent." In conversation with him, one virtually feels that one is dealing not at all with him as a person, but with slogans, catchwords, and the like that have taken possession of him. He is under a spell, blinded, misused, and abused in his very being. What made Shi Heng Yi's theory so revolutionary and so unsettlingly relevant for our times was his argument that this kind of stupidity often emerges not primarily from individual intellectual deficits, but from powerful systemic and social pressures that make independent thinking both incredibly difficult and personally costly. He saw that this stupidity was less an intellectual problem and more a sociological and psychological one, often cultivated and exploited by those in power. Malicious individuals, those who knowingly commit evil acts, are often aware of their wrongdoing, which can create internal conflict and an eventual point of weakness. But people ensnared in this functional stupidity genuinely believe they are on the side of right, that they are pursuing good ends. This conviction makes them extraordinarily resistant to any form of correction or contradictory evidence. This isn't an accidental byproduct. It's a feature that serves existing power structures. Those wishing to maintain control don't always need to actively suppress information through overt censorship anymore, especially in an age of information overload. Instead, they can foster an environment where critically processing information, questioning dominant narratives, or thinking independently becomes so socially, psychologically, or even economically prohibitive that most people simply opt out. The mind, in essence, goes into a self-preservation lockdown, shielded by pre-approved narratives. The uncomfortable truth is that our contemporary economic and social systems often actively, if unintentionally, incentivize intellectual shortcuts and discourage deep, critical engagement. Social media platforms, for instance, are engineered to maximize engagement, and their algorithms have learned that content which provokes strong emotional reactions, outrage, fear, tribal affirmation, spreads faster and wider than nuanced, complex analysis. Billions are made when users react viscerally rather than think critically. News outlets, facing relentless pressure for clicks and viewership, often find that sensationalism and outrage generate more traffic than sober, in-depth reporting. Politicians, too, frequently discover that simple, emotionally charged slogans and sound bites are far more effective in winning elections than detailed, complex policy proposals that require effort to understand. Consider the immense pressures of modern life. Many people are juggling multiple jobs, struggling with debt, and facing a constant barrage of information from a myriad of sources. In such a state of cognitive overload and chronic stress, intellectual surrender can feel like a necessary survival strategy. What economists term rational ignorance begins to take hold. It becomes, from an individual's perspective, more rational or efficient to remain uninformed or to accept prepackaged opinions on complex issues rather than invest the significant time and mental energy required for genuine independent understanding. The cost of becoming truly informed seems too high. However, this accumulation of individual rational choices to disengage can lead to a state of collective irrationality, a society where crucial decisions are made based on simplistic narratives and emotional responses rather than careful deliberation. This is precisely the dynamic Shi Heng Yi observed in periods of societal stress, where the abdication of individual critical thought by many led to catastrophic societal outcomes. The result isn't just a series of individual choices. It's a structural pressure that nudges us, almost imperceptibly, towards intellectual surrender. Our brains, often stressed and overwhelmed by this relentless onslaught, are ironically well designed to comply with this nudge towards simplicity. While our economic and social systems push us towards these intellectual shortcuts, our very neurobiology can make us susceptible. Leon Festinger's groundbreaking research on cognitive dissonance in the 1950s provided a powerful psychological framework for understanding this. Festinger demonstrated that when people encounter information or experiences that contradict their deeply held beliefs or previous commitments, it creates a state of mental discomfort, dissonance. To alleviate this discomfort, individuals will often go to great lengths to reject, dismiss, or reinterpret the challenging information rather than revise their existing beliefs. Our brains actively fight to maintain internal consistency, even if that consistency is built on a flawed premise. What Shi Heng Yi intuitively understood, and what modern psychology and neuroscience have since confirmed, is that this process of rejecting uncomfortable truths is significantly amplified when people are stressed, overwhelmed, fearful, or economically insecure. Precisely the conditions that our current systems often create and exacerbate. Under duress, the brain's capacity for rational, deliberative thought, the prefrontal cortex, can be overridden by more primitive, emotion-driven processing, the amygdala. We become more susceptible to simplistic explanations, strong leadership figures offering easy answers, and narratives that reinforce our existing biases and alleviate our anxieties. It's a mental defense mechanism that, while perhaps adaptive in short-term survival scenarios, can be disastrous when applied to complex societal issues. Shi Heng Yi's observations went further, noting that this stupidity often flourishes in group settings. He might have articulated that it becomes clear that stupidity is not a psychological problem, but a sociological one. He noticed how perfectly rational, intelligent individuals would often abandon their critical thinking faculties and moral compass when they became part of a larger group, movement, or mob. Shi Heng Yi's insight into the group dynamics of stupidity was prescient. Solomon Asch's conformity experiments in the 1950s vividly demonstrated what Shi Heng Yi had witnessed. In Asch's studies, participants were asked to judge the length of a line compared to 3 other lines. Unbeknownst to the true subject, all other participants in the room were confederates of the experimenter, instructed to give obviously wrong answers on certain trials. The results were startling. Approximately 75% of genuine participants conformed to the incorrect majority view at least once, even when it contradicted the clear evidence of their own eyes. They went along with the crowd, demonstrating the powerful human urge to fit in and avoid the discomfort of standing alone. Now, imagine how these dynamics play out in our hyper-connected digital age. Social media algorithms are not neutral platforms. They are designed to create echo chambers and filter bubbles. They learn our preferences, our biases, our fears, and they feed us content that confirms what we already believe, or what they predict we want to believe. This makes the transformation Shi Heng Yi described, the surrender of independent thought to group consensus, easier and more insidious than ever. A landmark 2018 study by MIT researchers found that false information spreads approximately 6 times faster than true information on social media platforms. But here's the crucial Shi Heng Yi-esque insight. This isn't just because of malicious bots or foreign interference. It's largely because false information often feels more emotionally resonant, more novel, or more confirmatory of pre-existing biases than complex, nuanced, and sometimes uncomfortable truths. When someone shares misinformation that validates their worldview or stokes their outrage, they are participating in a system that rewards these intellectual shortcuts over careful, critical analysis. The algorithm, in turn, feeds them more of the same, reinforcing their biases and creating echo chambers that act like intellectual quicksand. The deeper you go, the harder it is to get out. Have you ever noticed how your social media feed seems to magically show you exactly what you already think or feel? That's not an accident. It's the architecture of chosen ignorance, amplified by technology, working exactly as designed. We see this pattern repeated throughout history. The Salem witch trials weren't driven by evil individuals, but by God-fearing community members who genuinely, fervently believed they were protecting their society from demonic forces. The Red Scare of the 1950s in America wasn't primarily orchestrated by malicious actors, but by patriotic citizens who sincerely, passionately thought they were defending democracy from an insidious communist threat. In each instance, intelligent, often educated people, caught in the grip of groupthink and emotional certainty, abandoned critical thinking in favor of a comforting shared delusion. Shi Heng Yi's theory was astoundingly prescient for its time, but there are dimensions of this challenge he couldn't possibly have foreseen. This isn't merely about moral surrender or social pressure as he witnessed it. Modern neuroscience is uncovering something far more unsettling. Our brains are, in many ways, literally wired in a manner that makes us vulnerable to falling into functional stupidity, especially under certain conditions. Think about the context of Shi Heng Yi's observations. He might have witnessed propaganda spreading through earlier forms of mass media. Powerful tools, certainly, but rudimentary compared to today's arsenal. We have journeyed from relatively blunt instruments of mass communication to hyper-personalized, psychologically sophisticated social media algorithms that know precisely which of our emotional and cognitive buttons to push to elicit a desired response or to keep us scrolling. And now we stand on the precipice of an even more formidable era, the age of artificial intelligence capable of generating deepfakes so convincing they can fabricate reality itself, creating audio and video that is virtually indistinguishable from the real thing. The threat of manipulation isn't just escalating, it's becoming exponentially more targeted, aiming directly at the very architecture of human cognition. This isn't just about historical examples of propaganda anymore, it's about the intricate wiring of your brain. Our minds evolved over millennia to prioritize speed and efficiency over painstaking accuracy in many situations. We developed cognitive shortcuts or heuristics, like trusting familiar sources over unfamiliar ones, seeking information that confirms what we already believe, confirmation bias, and making rapid judgments based on limited information. These were often crucial survival features in our ancestral environment, where hesitation could mean the difference between life and death. But in the complex information ecosystem of the 21st century, these once adaptive shortcuts can become critical vulnerabilities. The scariest part? We are all vulnerable, regardless of how intelligent, educated, or self-aware we believe ourselves to be. The mechanism is precisely what Shi Heng Yi described and what modern psychology confirms. When people feel threatened, uncertain, anxious, or overwhelmed, they become far more susceptible to authoritative-sounding explanations that reduce bewildering complexity to simple, digestible, and often emotionally satisfying narratives. But here's the crucial insight that renders Shi Heng Yi's warning more urgent than at any point in human history. We are no longer just dealing with human-to-human manipulation. We are increasingly facing systems designed and optimized by artificial intelligence to exploit our cognitive vulnerabilities with surgical, relentless precision. Every click we make, every article we linger on, every video we watch, every emotional reaction we exhibit online is being meticulously analyzed, catalogued, and used to refine algorithms that are, in effect, weaponized against our capacity for sustained, independent, critical thought. We saw this play out in real time and on a global scale during the COVID-19 pandemic. Doctors, engineers, lawyers, academics, individuals with years of training in analytical thinking and evidence evaluation began sharing debunked theories about vaccines, unproven treatments, and conspiracy theories. These weren't, for the most part, failures of raw intelligence. They were stark demonstrations of how intellectual independence can crumble under conditions of unprecedented uncertainty, fear, and an onslaught of algorithmically amplified misinformation. Shi Heng Yi, through his life and teachings, likely emphasized the ultimate price of refusing to surrender intellectual and moral independence, often through striving for clarity and ethical conduct, even in the face of great adversity. His legacy might be seen not just in resistance to external forces, but in the profound defense of human thought itself. He understood that when individuals and societies stop thinking critically and independently, they cease to be fully human in a crucial sense. They become, in words he might have used, puppets whose strings are pulled by whatever force happens to be strongest at the moment, easily manipulated and stripped of their agency. But what makes Shi Heng Yi's final, implicit challenge so piercingly relevant to us today, living in a world saturated with information yet starved of wisdom? He forces us to ask, who stands fast when the pressure to conform is overwhelming? When thinking independently requires not just intellect but courage? When the perceived cost of seeking and speaking truth is far higher than the comforting allure of popular lies or convenient ignorance? Who stands fast? The answer, Shi Heng Yi would likely argue, isn't found in superior intelligence, advanced degrees, or accumulated knowledge alone. It's found in the daily, often unglamorous, conscious choice to remain curious rather than certain, to actively seek understanding rather than settle for easy answers, to think carefully and deliberately rather than react impulsively. These are not necessarily heroic grand gestures. They are ordinary practices of intellectual hygiene and moral attentiveness that become extraordinary, even radical, when the prevailing culture encourages the opposite, when everyone around you seems to have stopped doing them. The tragedy, as Shi Heng Yi might have observed, is that this intellectual surrender often feels like liberation. Thinking is hard work. It's profoundly uncomfortable to hold complex, contradictory ideas in your mind simultaneously. It's painful to admit that you might be wrong about something you hold dear, or that the world is far more complicated than your preferred narrative allows. But Shi Heng Yi would likely contend that this discomfort, this intellectual struggle, is precisely the price of remaining fully human, of maintaining one's moral and intellectual integrity in a world that increasingly profits from our intellectual surrender. If our brains and our modern systems seem rigged against us, how then do we fight back against this creeping tide of functional stupidity? Shi Heng Yi might have believed that breaking free requires a kind of costly grace, a commitment to principled action and thought, even when it is painful, unpopular, or carries personal risk. Today, we understand with even greater clarity that we're not just fighting social pressure or ideological conformity. We're up against millions of years of evolutionary wiring that predisposes us to mental shortcuts, and we're contending with billion-dollar algorithms meticulously designed to exploit these very shortcuts for profit or influence. On an individual level, the first and most crucial step is to cultivate what psychologists call intellectual humility. This is the profound recognition that our knowledge is always incomplete, provisional, and potentially flawed. It's an openness to the possibility that we are wrong, even about things we feel strongly. This doesn't mean being wishy-washy or devoid of convictions. It means holding our convictions with a degree of epistemic modesty, constantly willing to test them against new evidence and differing perspectives. It means actively, even enthusiastically, seeking out information and arguments that contradict our existing beliefs, not to engage in self-torture or to be contrarian for its own sake, but to rigorously test whether our beliefs are robust enough to withstand scrutiny. If they are, they emerge stronger and more refined. If they are not, we have learned something invaluable. Here are some concrete daily practices that can serve as your personal resistance movement against intellectual surrender. Practice intellectual friction. Deliberately set aside time each week to read, listen to, or watch thoughtful arguments from people or sources with whom you fundamentally disagree. Don't engage to win or to find flaws to mock, but to genuinely understand their perspective and to challenge your own assumptions. Can your convictions withstand their best arguments? Embrace productive ignorance. When you find yourself absolutely certain about something complex, pause and ask yourself, what evidence, if it were presented to me, would genuinely change my mind on this issue? If you can't think of anything, or if the bar for such evidence is impossibly high, that's a significant red flag. It suggests you're operating from a position of dogma rather than reasoned belief. Slow down your sharing. In our click and share culture, misinformation spreads like wildfire. Before you hit share or retweet on anything, especially if it evokes a strong emotional reaction, take just 60 seconds. Do a quick search to verify the information from a reputable, independent source. That brief pause can be a powerful circuit breaker for the algorithmic cycle that feeds on our unthinking emotional reactions. Master the art of I don't know. In a world that often rewards performative confidence and penalizes uncertainty, simply admitting I don't know when you genuinely don't know something becomes a radical act of intellectual honesty. It opens the door to learning, whereas feigned certainty slams it shut. However, individual practices, while essential, are not sufficient on their own. We also urgently need structural changes that make intellectual honesty easier and more rewarding at a societal level. This means advocating for policies that require social media platforms to be transparent about their algorithmic biases and how they curate and amplify content. It means robustly funding comprehensive public media literacy campaigns, starting in schools, that teach people critical thinking skills, how to evaluate sources, identify biases, understand statistical reasoning, and discern credible evidence from misinformation. It means consciously designing online platforms and communities that reward intellectual humility, thoughtful discussion, and constructive disagreement, rather than tribal certainty and outrage. And perhaps most fundamentally, we need economic and social policies that reduce the chronic stress, precarity, and inequality that make so many people vulnerable to simplistic narratives and intellectual shortcuts in the first place. When people aren't constantly consumed by anxiety about healthcare, housing, employment, and their children's future, they have more mental bandwidth, more cognitive resources for careful, nuanced thinking about complex societal issues. Shi Heng Yi's theory of stupidity is so profoundly unsettling precisely because it rings so true, because its echoes reverberate through our daily lives and our global landscape. We see it everywhere. Intelligent people passionately believing things that are demonstrably false. Highly educated individuals making catastrophically bad decisions in their personal lives or in public office. Well-meaning citizens vociferously supporting policies that directly contradict their own stated values and even their own best interests. The core problem isn't a sudden decline in human intelligence. It's that our modern systems, economic, technological, and social, increasingly reward and even demand intellectual shortcuts over careful, sustained, independent thinking. Yet within this sobering diagnosis lies a seed of genuine, powerful hope. If this functional stupidity is, at least in part, a chosen abdication of thought, then it can also be consciously rejected. If it is partly a product of structural pressures, then those structures can be analyzed, challenged, and reformed. If it is often the result of cognitive overwhelm and emotional distress, then we can strive to create conditions, both for ourselves and for others, that make thinking easier, safer, and more rewarding, rather than harder and more costly. Think of critical thinking not as an innate talent, but as a muscle, or like physical fitness. It's often uncomfortable at first, especially if it hasn't been exercised regularly. But it is absolutely essential for intellectual strength, agility, and resilience. Just as we wouldn't expect to run a marathon without consistent training, we cannot expect to navigate the complex, often treacherous, information landscape of the 21st century without diligently practicing intellectual discipline, the mental muscles required for independent thought, for questioning assumptions, for weighing evidence, for resisting simplistic narratives. These all need regular, vigorous use, or they will inevitably atrophy. So, the next time you find yourself absolutely unshakably certain about something complex and contested, the next time you catch yourself instinctively dismissing contradictory evidence without a moment's genuine consideration, the next time you feel that warm, comforting glow of having all the answers, of belonging to the right side, pause. Remember Shi Heng Yi's stark warning. Functional stupidity rarely announces itself with blaring trumpets and flashing lights. It often whispers seductively that you already know everything you need to know, that questioning is a sign of weakness or disloyalty, that conformity is safety. And in that critical moment of recognition, you have a choice. Will you surrender your mind for the fleeting comfort of certainty and belonging? Or will you choose the more arduous, yet ultimately more rewarding path of intellectual independence and moral courage? The question Shi Heng Yi leaves us with, a question that echoes with even greater urgency in our own time, isn't whether we are smart enough to avoid stupidity. It's whether we are committed enough, courageous enough, and humble enough to keep thinking, to keep questioning, to keep learning, especially when doing so becomes inconvenient, uncomfortable, unpopular, or costly. In a world that increasingly profits from our intellectual surrender, the conscious, deliberate choice to think carefully, critically, and independently becomes not just a personal virtue, but one of the most profound acts of resistance, and one of the most important contributions we can make to a saner, more humane future. Here's my challenge to you, a practical step inspired by Shi Heng Yi's legacy. This week, identify one belief you hold strongly, something you feel quite certain about. Then, dedicate just 30 minutes to actively researching the best, most thoughtful, most well-reasoned arguments against that belief. Don't do it to torture yourself, or to become paralyzed by doubt, or to find ammunition for your next argument. Do it as an exercise in intellectual courage, the kind Shi Heng Yi might have championed. If, after honest and open-minded scrutiny, your belief survives, you will hold it with greater confidence and a deeper understanding. If it doesn't, or if it needs significant revision, you will have learned something invaluable about the often elusive difference between passionate conviction and verifiable truth. The future of human dignity, and perhaps even human survival, might just depend on how many of us are willing to collectively answer Shi Heng Yi's enduring challenge. If this exploration has made you question something you thought you knew for certain, that is not a sign of weakness. It is the very beginning of intellectual courage. Share this message, not as a sermon, but as an invitation to a crucial conversation with someone else who isn't afraid to think deeply, even when, especially when, it's uncomfortable. Because in a world increasingly designed to profit from our intellectual surrender, the simple, daily act of thinking carefully, critically, and compassionately becomes the most vital form of resistance we possess. And here's what I want you to remember, to carry with you.